I'm really honored to be in this room. I've spent a lot of time, we've all spent a lot of time in this room together.
Yes.
This is the big fitting room at Tricorne Studios. I guess I was last year for Almost Famous, which was in the fall. Saleha, who you're going to see tomorrow in Hamlet. She plays Ophelia. She was the lead in Almost Famous. We got to make a lot of really beautiful things for her incredibly beautiful self. Kathy, this is your shop, yeah?
Yeah.
And Caitlin, what do you do here? What the hell do you do here?
A little bit of everything, a mixture of, I'm primarily in charge of getting all of our fabrics for everything we make and supplies and other things, whether the designers are providing that and we're doing linings or we're swatching the fabrics ourselves. It's a little bit of everything. And then scheduling times and figuring out where we're going to put all of you when you come to visit.
She's the glue that keeps us all together.
She is indeed.
She is indeed.
Kathy, will you talk a little bit, just like the story of your shop and what it is that you do and how you came to do it?
Yeah, I have done costuming most of my life. I started in high school because I love to sew, and through college. I came to New York. Well, first I worked at the Guthrie in Minneapolis for 4 years. Then I came to New York and worked for a woman named Barbara Matera, who had an amazing shop, and I worked there for 22 years. And then I opened Tricorne. My love is draping and making patterns and taking a sketch and sculpting something out of it.
And draping as opposed to tailoring, or draping as opposed to, or just the art of
I think that I include all of that in that. Yeah, the pattern making process, the taking it from a drawing to a three-dimensional object. The making of it is my passion. At Tricorne, we have 4 people who do the same thing that I do, and we all work in groups. We call them a draper, the person who's in charge of the group and makes the pattern. And then they have first hands who do the cutting and help supervise the stitchers, and then a group of stitchers. And that's generally how we're set up to run.
And you have you do some beading here?
We do beading. We have a beading department, and we have a small craft and dyeing department. We used to have 2 beaders full-time. One is retired, so we have one. We also I'll show you when we go out into the workroom. We've just marked out a fully beaded dress for Bernadette Peters, who's going to appear in London in the Sondheim Tribute,
soon,
Old
right?
Friends,
Yeah.
soon. And we're going to send that to California to be beaded, just timing-wise. They'll put 5 people on it, and it'll be back in a week and a half. We have a couple of tailors. Yeah, we do primarily women's work, women's wear, but we have done. We did some suits for Clint, for Elephant Man when he designed it, and we do a lot of men's wear for Wicked. These are Wicked things here that we were going to show you.
And what are there? What has been through this all the posters that you see are things that Kathy's made costumes for. Out in the hall, you'll see them. But what are some of the things that you have that linger in your mind as shows that you've either loved working on or?
We do
all my shows.
We do a bit of Hamilton. More than a bit. We do quite a bit of Hamilton, and that then grows exponentially because they have so many tours. The same was true of Wicked, although they've cut back on their tours now. So that we have a lot of shows that are long running that keep repeating, which is helpful to our business because there's always that to keep us going in between other smaller projects.
And if I'm a costume designer and I come to you and I'm like, hey, I'm doing this show, am I bringing you? Do you do everything in the show? Like, do you do all the costumes, or do those sometimes get broken up to different shops or to different things?
Rarely do we do all of them anymore. There was a time when a shop would do a whole show. But I think it's primarily because producers have cut the number of weeks they want to rehearse a show and prepare a show, or there's a different process for that they workshop it or something. So there's generally, when I first started, we'd have 12 weeks about from start to finish to do a show, and now it's maybe 4 or 5 from the minute the sketches come in the door to the clothes have to leave. So it just becomes a matter of how much can you do that fast.
Yeah.
So it's often distributed among shops, and there's a lot of shops in this neighborhood. So that helps the designers.
Yeah, so just so when mostly I would say you do Broadway shows and film and TV.
And we have a lot of ballet out there right now.
Oh, great.
We do ballet and opera.
Many, not all, many Broadway shows rehearse in this neighborhood, and many of the costume shops are here. So when actors are called for fitting, they usually, they don't have to get on a train and go an hour away. They can walk 15 minutes or 10 minutes away. So it's a convenience for all of us to be close, because as Kathy was saying, everybody's time gets very valuable, and so the less time it takes for an actor to be out of rehearsal to come to a fitting because they have less time, et cetera, we're sort of here to maximize that and keep. Also, as designers, like I'm doing a show with Kathy in the fall, and Kathy is working on some of it. Gilberto, who's a tailor, who's just down on 36th Street, is going to do some of it. Colin Davis-Jones, who's just around the corner, is going to do a little bit of it. So it's also, on any given day, it's also easier for me as the designer because I have to be in all of those places. And so it's nice in this neighborhood, although it's an increasing rarity, but it is nice in this neighborhood that everything is sort of close together. And the fabric stores mostly are also all very close to here. So it's really a thing that you can do. When I was doing more costumes and spent more time, kind of actively doing all that stuff, I'd take the train to 39th Street and then I'd spend the day in this little, rectangle and then go home because everything that I needed to do was here, which was really convenient.
Yeah, our supplies are nearby, so that helps.
And the theaters are nearby.
And the theaters
are nearby, so we can walk, once you have the clothes and you're on stage, we can come and check on you easily because we can walk there.
Yeah, very true. What do you have what is in front of us?
This is 3 phases I thought you might be interested in. This is a Wicked costume. This is one of the original, it's coming up on its 20th anniversary. So this is one of the original ones we made for Emerald City. We are now making probably a dozen costumes for Shiki, which is a production company in Japan. And they're doing Wicked. So we made, this is a mock-up. This is what we make first out of, this one's out of cotton drill to use for fitting. And you can see we've opened up the sleeve here and raised the cap and made some adjustments in terms of size and length.
So you make it in a really cheap fabric first, a relatively inexpensive fabric that kind of is related.
Something that's a comparable weight.
Yeah. So that it's very easy to, you can draw on it, you can pin things, you can fold things over, you can staple cards to it, you can take all the notes. It becomes a kind of living document of all the notes and thoughts that you had in the fitting room.
Yeah, you can treat it with abandon because it's not precious.
Right.
And so any changes that you want to make, you're not afraid to just go at it.
And did that start? Sorry, Kathy. Did that start as pattern pieces, or did you sort of drape
before this? Yeah. I would drape it probably with muslin on the form and create the pattern. And the thing about Wicked is that everything you can see, this is all askew. So you have to drape the whole thing. Sometimes things are symmetrical, so you only have to do half of it. But so I would do it in muslin, and then from the muslin, I would put it into paper and true it up and make sure everything's marked, matches and is balanced. Then from that paper, I would cut this. So then after I fit this, I go back and correct the paper. And then from that, we'd cut this. So this is the beginning. You can see all these lines are marked on here where Israel, you'll see out in the room, puts these ribbons, and he's going to go back. He's got another ribbon to go in between, because you see there's a wide one and a skinny one. So he's doing all the ribbon applique work.
So this fabric didn't come to you with the stripes?
No. These are 2 ribbons that we've stitched together first and then stitched onto the garment.
That's amazing. So one of the things, can I pop this out just to show folks? So this is, I think at this point it's like a Xerox of many generations ago of Susan Hilperty's sketch for this character, right? So she made that in 2002 probably, or 2003.
I guess, yeah.
Is that a little, did she draw a back view of it?
Yeah, we
Great.
talked about it and we.
Great, so that's, again, a 20-year-old, that's Susan Hilferty saying like, oh, I think it kind of, the back is sort of like this, and it does this, and this is how that's askew. But Susan has drawn some, what's interesting, there aren't real stripes on this.
No.
In the thing. There are on the pants.
Yeah.
But it's, a lot of times you'll go out into the world and you'll think of like, oh, this would be so great if it was a striped coat. And you'll go look and you'll think, great, I'm going to go look for a striped fabric, and they don't have it. Either it's like they don't have the right color, or they have the right color but it's made out of chiffon and you want to make a big tough jacket out of it. So then you have to think about, well, how can I make, it is striped and it is the right color, but it's really flat. Sometimes if the stripe is woven, it's just like it's like a flat pattern. And so what's beautiful about adding these ribbons is A, you get to control exactly what the color is and the spacing of it, but also the texture changes, right? So there's something that just gives some life and some depth. Here, Susan creates depth in this sketch because she uses watercolor, and watercolor kind of blobs around, and I draw everything on Procreate, right? When I Procreate, I don't do flat colors so much. Those kind of things blob around and stuff like that. And you do that because there's just it's nice to have some things that kind of catch the light and have some dimension and stuff. So it's the way to kind of do that in real life is to add and work in some texture that gives your garment some depth. So what happens is every show and every costume has these sheets that have a record of the fabric that was purchased, where it was purchased, and a piece of that fabric. So that even though that was 20 years ago, probably at this point that fabric doesn't exist anymore.
The store might not.
And probably the store doesn't exist anymore. So you're using these as a way to keep making the thing that you have a key to what the original used to be. And that is, you have one of these for every costume, probably for every iteration of every costume, mm-hmm. and how many costumes is in this binder, do you think?
Probably a couple dozen at least, if not more. There's
in that binder, there's probably only 2 costumes.
2 costumes, but
So this is 2 costumes, all of these pages.
But we've made it probably
yeah.
10 or
you can see
12
here
times.
The way we keep record of this person had it and we had it here, then it changes, But you can see on this one, the pants aren't in here, but strangely enough, on the costume here,
the pants have stayed the same.
The pants have stayed the same,
Yeah.
which is very rare in a Wicked
And I don't
costume.
think they're having that made.
They must have bought a lot.
Many of them for Wicked, they've gone to a company that will custom weave it for them, so that they can
So you
keep
just always have the
They
fabric,
can keep
right.
it the same.
Yeah.
I'm trying to see
Yeah.
if there was something. But yeah, the different ribbons that have been used and the different widths that have changed.
Like a little history book.
Yeah.
Yeah. Cool.
Yeah.
Very beautiful.
It's not true of all shows that they keep it so true
Right.
to the original, but I was told, and I believe it to be true, that Joe Mantello really wants to see the show that he made.
Yeah.
And when they open a tour, he doesn't want to see something different up there. He wants to see what it was.
Yeah, it's true. So Joe is the director of Wicked. Somebody I also work with. I can confirm that I've never done a show that run as long as Wicked. Few have, but yeah, you know, once a show has a life, you want his expectation is that that show is always, you know, that everybody worked really hard to sign off on a thing that everybody liked, and so he wants that to be the thing that everybody sees all the time, unless there's a conscious decision to change something, which everybody would then make together.
Yeah.
And Wicked is really known as a show that is kept up kind of incredibly beautifully, because it takes a lot of effort and it takes producerial will, it takes money to make sure that things always kind of stay, you know, really stay the same. And if something's starting to change or fall apart, then they go in and they fix it and replace it. It's you know, it's a whole kind of ecosystem. Is sewing for the theater something that's a specific thing that you need to learn?
Well, I started sewing for my grandmother. She always stitched, and she just let me sit down and do it, and the next thing I knew, I was making dresses for her. I mean, I think it's the same in many ways.
Home sewing versus sewing for the theater, yeah.
I mean, this is going to be worn 8 times a week, going to be danced in, it's going to be sweat in,
Yeah.
you know, there's all those differences. But making something is basically at the core the same. You're creating.
So if you sew, you sew.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's different techniques. We'll show you some bodices out in the room, you know, you're probably not making a ballet bodice. I didn't make one for my grandmother. But I think sewing is, you know, stitching.
And at the Guthrie, were you like a first hand first, or
I was a junior draper.
Junior draper, nice.
I was a junior
Did you have to
draper.
wear, like,
It was
little
listed in the
shorts?
program.
Yeah,
I had a beanie. Then I graduated into a draper. I lucked into that. I first went there and interviewed, and I didn't get hired. And I worked in a dinner theater, and the designer was the assistant director of the Guthrie. Because I was like, you know, I wasn't even out of college yet when I tried to get the job. And so I made things for him, and he went back and said, hire her.
Nice.
So that's how I got the job. And I met a lot of people who were from New York at that time coming to work at the Guthrie. And so my husband and I said, well, let's go see what New York is about. Everybody's from New York. And then, I don't know,
And here you are.
45 years later, here I still am. I was only going to come for 5 years or so and then go back.
Yeah.
But
Yeah. I know that story.
How much time on average do you think it makes to make one costume?
well, it really depends on how complex it is. Like putting all these stripes on here, this will take, you know, probably 3 days of just putting the stripes on it before although he went ahead and made his pocket because I think it was more fun than making stripes. But it really depends on the garment, you know.
Can it? What's the does it take you're gonna make a silk blouse for me?
Yeah. 3 days, maybe. You know, from the time, because we'll make something and we'll fit it first.
Yeah.
And you'll make all the changes on the collar or the cuffs or whatever. And then we'll go back and we'll cut it, and then we'll make it, and then we'll fit it again. So.
And do you guys know that process, like the kind of fitting process, right? Like that's when you make this thing, and then the actor comes in, and then the actor and the designer, sometimes the director, the draper, the first hand, like everybody comes in to sort of make sure that it's just technically that it's fitting them and it's doing all the things and all the lines are in a good place and they can move their arms and all that stuff. But also there's a lot of big decisions that can be made especially in that first fitting. Sometimes you haven't picked the fabric yet, so you're looking at different fabrics together and looking at them from a distance and all that stuff. Like the first fitting is can be a very like loosey-goosey sort of affair where you're really starting, even though you have something solid to look at, you're really also, that's like where the actor joins the process. And as you know, that's work has to be done in order for that entrance to happen, but then there's like a whole other journey to happen. So
sometimes you're off and running, and sometimes you're starting over after that fitting.
Yeah, and sometimes that's because sometimes the actor's like, I feel weird in this, or I don't like this, or this isn't where we're going. Sometimes the designer is like, I'm not into this, and like, sometimes it's like just didn't fit in the way we thought it was going to fit because the measurements were old, and there can be a number of reasons why the first fitting is not.
Hopefully they know what they're going to have to do in it too. That's a big thing.
Yeah,
like,
when they come back on the second thing and they're like, I did the splits.
And I have 20 seconds to change.
Yeah.
So that makes a difference.
Yeah. But you sort of begin learning really at that fitting.
Yeah. It's exciting. That's an exciting point.
It is exciting and nerve-wracking, I would say. Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool.
Want to get out of this hot room?
Yeah, let's get out of this hot room.
I think it's
Cool. Where should we go first?
This is Ellen. She does a lot of our craft work. She's making a Glinda collar right now. Yeah, we have, I think, 3 Glinda bubble dresses in the midst of being made in the room.
So this goes around. Is this, Kathy, does this go like around?
Yeah.
Like around her neck?
Uh-huh. And fastens down to the bodice.
Nice.
Yeah.
What do you think, guys?
Yeah. You look popular.
I do. Look. There's the lie right there. Is there part of Glinda in that room?
There's some Glinda on the some of her petals there, but most of her skirt is here.
Come along. Sparkles.
These two are these are Glinda engagements that are going on their way to Australia. They're going in a box later today to Australia. And then this is a Glinda for Broadway that will probably go next week. And she's got to get the rest of her petals on, but she's got her handles. She has handles built in that pick up her hoop so she can step and get her whole skirt up.
I think she was saying this is Glinda.
These are all
going to Australia, is that right?
Beaded. I can show you in the back of the room there's some that aren't lined yet.
And do you guys
all these sequins are stitched on by hand.
Amazing. So this is
all around. Yeah. She has a small hoop inside and then lots of layers of petticoat to try to keep her light and fluffy. Yeah.
We like to zip you up and then drops down.
All up in here. So she's got that and then all these layers. Right behind over here is the dress that we're making for Bernadette. Wow. It's a dress that Bernadette Peters, a dress that she first had in 2008, and we're going to make her a fresh one. So you can see that Ethan, this is Ethan. Ethan marked this all out. Want to show them?
Yeah, sure.
That's the whole beading pattern.
Yeah.
And then all of these lines are traced on. And then it will be sent. This is the one we're going to send to California to get done quickly. And if you look here, you can see that the beads are all stitched on individually from the back on the whole dress. So it starts with plain black net, and then all these lines of beads will be put onto it. So Rosanna is working on this is a bib for the front of one of the Madame Morrible costumes. But she's done all this. This is for Aladdin, and you can pick these up and look at them, and you can see how she does it. She's got a crochet hook, and she works from the back side and crochets the beads. She holds the beads underneath and applies them. So you can see she's applied all those beads. And she did all this stitching
this is the old
and
one
all that
you're
beading.
Making this, is that right? Yeah.
It's yeah. This is the dress. that all those parts are for.
Everybody sketches in a different style. You don't need to sketch to be a costume designer. There's lots of ways to communicate that. But Bob Pizziola is a particularly good sketcher.
You're okay,
7 of
Stella.
the yellow
Don't worry.
ones,
You're
and then
okay.
there are 11 pink flowers.
Right. So that's Bob's beautiful sketch, which makes other designers very envious. And frankly irritated. Those are all all these little beautiful. And does this really come and go like this? Ugh. Right? Like it's not just, you don't just like slam it on the bottom, just like a little boop, and then disappears and a little boop.
What kind of material is is it like with colored pencils or with markers?
He's watercolor.
Water.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
I might have a real one.
Yeah.
There's yellow ones, which is what this is, and there's pink ones. The bodice for this one is over on Libby's table, and the pink version of this skirt is hanging up in the hallway upside down.
Insanity. Yeah. I mean, I can like draw people. I can't.
Yeah.
Nobody does what Bob does.
Yeah.
Quite.
It was amazing.
What are
things.
these?
Those are Glinda's bodices.
Ooh, do you mind?
No, yeah.
Go for it.
This is a Glinda bodice as well.
Glinda. Oh, look at that.
Hand stitch too, right?
That is all a million things. What do you do in the machine and what do you do by hand?
The beading is all done by hand on this layer of net. You can see there's a layer of net over the top.
And is beading usually done on net? Like this kind of beading? Yeah.
Often done
Yeah.
on net. And it's strong.
Yeah.
Yeah, the sleeves are all done. Risana does them all on the bead frame.
Got it. And then machine, and then
It's machined together.
Machined together.
Yeah.
Or-
Yeah.
And this is such a specific and beautiful, I mean, just there's like so many different sequins here, right? It's bonkers. One of the things that I think is it's so beautiful about what Bob does too, and I think this is true for costume and lighting and sets and everything, right? There's choices to make, right? And part of that is related to the resources you have, but you can choose, you can just be like, oh, sequins, and you can just buy some trim in a store and stick it on. But when it's up to you to pick things, you can make the choices like this. You can decide that you want a scatter of things in different colors because that makes depth, and different shapes because it reflects the light differently. You know, the thing on the petticoat is so great to me, like, right? Just like a little, like, I don't want to just like slam this on the bottom. I just want like these little moments that they're like a reward for the person watching it. They sort of make it more special, right? Even if it's and not every costume is a tutu, not every costume is Glinda, but I think what I tend to call it kind of generosity of thinking, but it's a luxury and a generosity of like, I'm gonna reward you, even if it's like, I'm wearing dirty jeans, right? But it's like, oh, maybe I've written on the jeans in the corner with a ballpoint pen, and you're imbuing them with your own artistic point of view. And I always think of fabric like paint. You have the ability to really
exactly like
create depth and texture and meaning and surprise and all of that stuff just using that fabric. It doesn't have to be, if I drew this thing, I'd probably draw like, maybe my bodice would just be a single color. But Bob has really seen this, like, it's, kind of this color, and it helps tie, like, these are weird colors together, right? These are kind of weird colors together, but he makes them, kind of creates synthesis very carefully with them by sort of adding there's a little bit of green in here, which makes sense with the green in here, and then there's a little bit of that yellow, which makes sense with that yellow, then helps make sense of that yellow. This copper helps you sort of make sense of that thing. It's really sophisticated, and that's, as a viewer, I mean, as a person who's nerdy about clothes, I get very excited about it, but as a viewer, it's also thrilling because you're not clocking. If you saw this ballet, you probably wouldn't be like, oh, I know what happened, which is there was like a little thing but you clock that it feels special. And that is, to me, that's like the pleasure of our job, and I feel like you guys have that in spades as well. You know, you make the inside special.
Yeah, the placement of this pattern is so rewarding to me, and that's Libby and Francesca. Worked it out because it's quite a big pattern, and these are tiny little pieces. So it's mirrored here, and then there's a dark spot on the sides, and it comes around, and it's like where you decide to place that on that pattern.
Yeah, I mean,
Makes a difference.
Yeah, I think design is like picking stuff for a living. You just pick stuff. You just make decisions about stuff all the time. Like this, not that. That one, not this one. Oh, I got this fabric. You're not done yet. How does that fabric meet when it meets the other fabric? Could it flip? Should it be the mirror? Should you use the backside? Should you pipe it in something else? Like that's that kind of decision. And I think I'm looking at you because I think also as an actor, like, right, you're making all those decisions about, you know, your character or whatever, and I feel like that we just have it's the same tools, and similarly you're rewarded by the depth by which you consider all of those details. And I think so much of this, what Kathy does, and you know what Bob brings to her, and you know, Bob Mackey brings to that dress, and you know, all those people bring to those things. What Susan brings to Glinda is a real interesting depth of choice making. So do you guys do this in-house?
This is sent out. This is called Bonaz, and it's done with a cord with threads wrapped around it by a very old machine. And it's just across the street. So we're all right here together.
And then this is trim that you nailed down?
and that's trim.
And then it's lined in something else, and then the inner sleeve is something else.
Yep.
So it's a hefty.
It's a costume.
Yeah. That's a real built to last. Yeah, beautiful. Where's the back?
Yeah.
That's so beautiful.
So that's the whole plate that needs to be looped up and embroidered, beaded in the end. And so,
wow, amazing. Looks like candy.
It does. When it's all done, it looks like candy and moves like candy.
Perfect. Incredible. Yeah.
What are all of the steps, I guess, like, that you need to have, like, from the first sketch maybe, and then there's the actual template, and then fill me in.
So there's, I'm going to take a show that I'm about to do. Tomorrow on our lunch break, I'm going to come to Kathy and have a meeting about a show. And I'm going to bring her just a sketch that I've done and some research. It's a kind of modern show, so it's not a corset and there's not all that stuff. So I'm going to bring that sketch. We're going to talk about it. We're going to make a plan. That sketch has it'll hopefully is clear enough, you know, that Kathy is probably going to be able to then drape something kind of preliminarily on a form. I'm going to have a couple questions about what it does around the bodice, and I'll be like, oh, maybe we should just look at this thing and this thing, and she's going to drape that up. She'll make and that maybe we'll have some questions about that, and then I'll come in and look at it and be like, oh, I like that side seems weird. Great. Then she'll make the mock-up with the thing that we think it's going to be. She'll put that into we'll fit our actor. In the meantime, we're going to buy some fabric. Maybe after the fitting, maybe before the fitting. And that fabric is going to get recorded. And if it has buttons, those buttons are going to get recorded. We're going to buy one extra button so it lives in the Bible and all that stuff. Then we're going to have that fitting. Then that mock-up is going to get turned into a pattern so that it can be then cut out in real fabric. Mm-hmm. And then we're going to have another fitting in the real fabric. Mm-hmm. And then hopefully we're going to be like, oh my God, it's perfect. Like, just, you know, let's snip the threads and call it done. Mm-hmm. Or maybe we'll have some adjustments to make. From then, that's sort of its pieces, right?
Yeah, and the thing is, because we work on these shows that have, generally will make an understudy. So dependent on different body types and whatnot, they can use that pattern then to go to the next person sometimes and use it, right? They make adjustments, they make it smaller, they make it bigger, they figure out maybe it needs to be longer because she's taller or whatnot. So that those patterns are like the Bible we were showing you with various fabrics over the years. Some of these shows we have multiple versions of the same pattern, and we just keep it as a document because who knows when we'll need that, you know. And then we get someone's measurements, and you can sort of say, oh, this is a good jumping off point. Again, we don't go back necessarily to the draping point, you know. You can start from, you can kind of go,
You don't start from zero,
you don't have to
yeah.
go back to zero again.
What are things that stick out? Anybody? It's like a word or a thing that you saw that you were like, ah, it's cool, or I hated that, or another question.
I love the draping of like the poinsettia and like the winter gown. Like that was really
snow?
nice, and like
Yeah.
I got to talk to Cammie, and like she was really nice, and she gave me like advice about like
That was cool.
Yeah.
like school and stuff.
I don't know what it's called, but the thick, well, it's not thick, but like the wide piece of cloth that you use to keep things like firmly together.
The stiff stuff.
Yeah. I guess it's, but I realized the importance of it and that it's used pretty a lot. So
Yeah.
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 that was cool.
It is cool. It's
8
like-
times a week dancing.
Yeah.
Things get kind of sweaty.
Yeah.
Helps hold them up.
I loved the bodice for the Orlando version of the flower for the Nutcracker, especially the green and blue piece where the blue was actually frilled underneath, but it
The little
peeked through-
slashes
it
and
peeked
puffs.
through the green,
Yeah.
and it created like just such this beautiful depth, and it's such a small detail, but like the entire time we were talking about it, my eyes were drawn to just that detail the entire
Just that
time.
Yeah.
The patterns really stuck out to me. How you guys use small patches to create these such beautiful patterns that are so put together. It's
Yeah.
amazing.
It's fun.
I really kind of liked the chaos of it.
Yeah.
How it's like you have like so many different shows that you're like, even if it's not like you're not working on all of the costumes from the shows, it's like a piece of that and a piece from here, and
Yeah.
it's just so cool to see it literally like everywhere. It was really cool.
Yeah, that table, especially with the like big like green
Yeah.
wicked chicken and then the like candy
Yeah.
thing. And I was like, I'm
Yeah.
somebody who's like, I think weird things should go together, but I was like, I don't remember that candy in Wicked. I remember it from something else.
Yeah.
But it's cool that it's all just like
Yeah.
very organized chaos, I would say.
But it's chaos
Yeah.
sometimes.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a lot of things. And keeping your priorities straight and getting the one that has to go out the door first, but yet, keeping the others moving.
I have a question. Do you like fitting? This is like a little bit of a Sophie's choice, but do you like draping more, like being like just you and the fabric and the form, or fittings?
The first fitting is probably the best part of it all, because then it's everybody, and it's in motion. The motion part is rewarding.
Yeah.
To see it move.
One of the things that I like working with Kathy, it's true also with Eric and other talented costume makers, is that it's like everybody is super vulnerable in that first fitting. The actor's vulnerable partly because they're like in their underwear, like they're meeting everybody for the first time. It's like very intense. So that's why there's curtains on the doors and stuff. They're physically vulnerable, but also everybody's like, you're hoping the actor, as the designer, you're like, I hope you like what we're gonna put on you, and you're like, it's like everybody's very vulnerable. And so what for me is the pleasure of just knowing Kathy's so good that it allows me the confidence. It actually allows me the confidence to just do my job, as opposed to like have to perform a kind of thing. Like I know Kathy, I know that she has she's gonna take that information and help me really deliver it. And just to have the confidence of knowing that it's in such amazing hands, and that as beautiful as it's going to be in that fitting, that it's going to get transformed. When it leaves there, it's going to go turn. It's like a cocoon. It's like a caterpillar or whatever. Those turn into butterflies, right? So it's like a nice caterpillar, but that it's going to go like turn into an amazing thing, and that confidence then allows me to be calmer. So then the actor who's had the least amount of time with that stuff, I can be the person who's like, helping them through the thing. And sort of like that ecosystem really lets us all be present as kind of as safe as is possible, you know, in a moment which can feel very scary, you know.
The person wearing it has to be comfortable
Yeah.
and confident
Yeah.
in the choices that were made
Yeah.
by all of us, or it's just not going to work.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks for coming. You know where we are. If you're in New York, stop by anytime.
Ding ding.
Ding ding.